The moment Sallie Sutton stepped off the stagecoach in Redemption Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1882, her entire world was reduced to a single brutal fact. She had nowhere to go, no one who knew her name, and exactly 43 cents to her name after the long ride from San Antonio. The town of Redemption Creek was not what she had imagined when she had answered the advertisement pinned to the wall of a church hall 3 weeks prior. She had pictured something with a little more dignity, perhaps a water tower with fresh paint, a hotel with glass windows, maybe even a tree with its leaves still on it. Instead, she found herself staring down a main street that looked as though it had recently survived both a drought and a disagreement. The wooden storefronts leaned slightly in opposite directions, as if they were tired of holding each other up. A dog of indeterminate breed lay sleeping directly in the center of the road, unbothered by the heat or by the arrival of the stagecoach. Sallie pulled her carpetbag from beneath the seat and stepped down into the red dust, straightening her spine the way her mother had always told her a woman ought to when she felt like collapsing. She was 24 years old, with dark auburn hair that refused to stay pinned, green eyes that her late father had called honest, and the kind of stubborn jaw that people mistook for serenity. She was not serene. She was terrified. The advertisement had promised a position as a schoolteacher in the newly organized Redemption Creek schoolhouse, which was meant to open in September. The letter she had received from the town's postmaster, a man named Gerald Fitch, had confirmed the position and told her she would be welcomed with great warmth. Gerald Fitch was not at the stagecoach stop. Nobody was, except the dog. She approached the general store, whose sign read Hadley's Dry Goods and Other Necessaries, and pushed the door open. A brass bell announced her arrival. Behind the counter stood a heavy-set woman with silver-streaked hair and an expression of permanent suspicion who softened precisely 2 degrees when she looked Sallie over. "You the schoolteacher they sent for?" the woman asked. "I am," Sallie said. "Sallie Sutton from San Antonio. I was told to ask for Gerald Fitch." The woman behind the counter made a sound that was somewhere between a sigh and a laugh. "Gerald Fitch took a bad turn in February and hasn't risen from his sickbed since. His wife's been managing his affairs, but she's got her hands full. The schoolhouse is still being built, last I heard. Half the town council is arguing about where to put the door." Sallie absorbed this the way a person absorbs a splash of cold water, quickly and without enjoying it. "And the accommodations that were promised. Mrs. Hannigan has a room above her laundry that she lets out. It's clean enough. Won't cost you too much." The woman extended her hand. "I'm Bess Hadley. I run this store. My husband ran off to Colorado 2 years ago, so now I run it alone, which is frankly an improvement." Sallie shook her hand. "Can you point me toward Mrs. Hannigan's?" Bess pointed left, gave her a series of instructions involving a broken fence post and a rooster that apparently always stood in the same spot, and then pressed a small paper bag of dried apricots into Sallie's hand. "For the road," she said. "You look like you haven't eaten since you left civilization." Sallie thanked her and stepped back out into the fierce Texas sun. She found Mrs. Hannigan's without much trouble, which was a mercy, because she was not certain she had much trouble left in her reserves. The room above the laundry was small but clean, with a single iron-framed bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the alley where someone had planted a determined little row of marigolds against all odds. Sallie sat on the edge of the bed, clasped her hands in her lap, and permitted herself exactly 2 minutes of private despair before she stood up again and began to unpack. She had been in Redemption Creek exactly 4 days when she first encountered Dexter Alden, and the circumstances were not romantic in any conventional sense. She had been walking back from the schoolhouse site, which was real at least, a half-built structure at the north end of town with actual walls and a partial roof, when her path was blocked by a riderless horse standing in the middle of the road with its reins tangled around a hitching post in a way that suggested considerable panic had occurred sometime recently. The horse was a tall, rangy bay gelding with a white blaze down its nose, and it was trembling in a manner that suggested it had recently experienced something deeply upsetting. Sallie knew horses. Her father had kept a small ranch outside San Antonio until the bank had taken it when she was 17, and she had grown up more comfortable with animals than with people. She approached the bay slowly, speaking in a low, even voice, her hands loose at her sides. Her eyes dropped so as not to challenge the horse directly. She worked the reins free from the post with patient fingers, smoothed her hand along the horse's neck, and had just gotten the animal settled when a man came running around the corner of the farrier's shop at considerable speed and pulled up short at the sight of her. He was tall, lean in the way that came from actual work rather than from not eating, with dark brown hair that curled slightly at the ends where the sweat had gotten to it, and a jaw that needed a shave. He wore a worn leather vest over a faded blue shirt, and he had the kind of eyes that were difficult to determine the color of from a distance, which was inconvenient because Sallie found herself wanting to determine the color of them. He was not a young man in the sense of being a boy, but he was not old either. She guessed he was perhaps 28 or 29, though the outdoors had given his face a weathered quality that made the exact number hard to pin down. He stopped, looked at the horse, looked at her, and said, "You untangled him." "He was frightened," Sallie said. "He's always frightened. He's the worst horse I've ever owned, and I've owned him for 6 years. He approached the bay, who shied slightly and then accepted him with an air of resignation. What spooked him was a tin can that rolled off the back of the Hadley delivery cart. He's afraid of tin cans." "That does seem like a significant limitation in a working horse," Sallie said. The man looked at her then with genuine amusement, and she saw his eyes were hazel, a warm greenish-brown that shifted as the afternoon light moved. "It is," he agreed. "He's fast when he's not terrified, and he's got good sense about cattle. You learn to work around a thing's weaknesses when its strengths are worth keeping." He offered his hand. "Dexter Alden, I've got a cattle ranch about 4 miles east of here." "Sallie Sutton," she said, shaking it. "I'm the new school teacher." Something crossed his face, a flicker of recognition. "Gerald Fitch sent for you, I heard. I'm sorry about the situation. Fitch should have written to warn you about his health before you made the trip." "I would have come anyway," Sallie said, because it was true. There had been nothing holding her in San Antonio. Her mother had passed the previous autumn, her brother had married and moved to New Orleans, and the boarding house where she had been living had been raising its rates with cheerful regularity. "The position is still available. The schoolhouse is still being built. I've spoken with the remaining council members and they've confirmed the arrangement stands." Dexter nodded slowly. "Well," he said, "that's something, then." He looked as though he wanted to say more but had not yet decided whether it was his business to say it. Then he touched the brim of his hat. "Welcome to Redemption Creek, Miss Sutton. It's an odd little place, but it tends to grow on people." "Like a very specific kind of moss," Sallie said, and regretted it immediately because it was a strange thing to say, but Dexter Alden laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of him, and the sound of it did something peculiar to the inside of Sallie's chest that she chose not to examine right at that moment. He rode away on his treacherous horse, and Sallie walked back toward Mrs. Hannigan's laundry, and she did not think about hazel eyes or the sound of an unexpected laugh. She thought about the schoolhouse and the curriculum, and whether she could get chalk delivered from the county seat in time for September. She was very firm about this. She was, of course, lying to herself. The weeks that followed were busy in the way that building a life from nothing tends to be. Sallie threw herself into the preparation of her classroom with the single-mindedness of a woman who needed to be useful. She ordered textbooks through Bess Hadley's catalog, organized the enrollment of children from the surrounding ranches and farms, and spent 3 afternoons arguing constructively with the town council about the placement of 2 windows and a map of the United States. Bess Hadley became her primary source of local intelligence, delivering it alongside dry goods and unsolicited opinions in equal measure. It was from Bess that Sallie learned about Dexter Alden in greater detail. He had come to Redemption Creek 7 years prior, arriving with a small sum of money, a great deal of determination, and very little else. He had bought a failing piece of land east of town, spent 2 brutal winters rebuilding the fencing and the waterway, and had turned it into a working cattle ranch that now employed 4 hands and produced respectable numbers for the spring drives. He had never married, which Bess relayed with the tone of someone presenting a relevant fact that she expected you to find interesting. "Why not?" Sallie asked, attempting to sound purely academic about the question. "He was engaged once," Bess said, wrapping a length of ribbon around a spool with unnecessary care, "to a girl named Clara Marsh from over in Denton County. She changed her mind about frontier life somewhere around the second winter and went back east. Can't say I blame her, but it left him quiet in a way he hadn't been before." She paused. "He's a good man, works hard, doesn't drink to excess. Comes in here every Saturday for his weekly supplies, and he always says please and thank you, which I mention because it's rarer than you'd think." Sallie folded the new classroom schedule she'd been pretending to review. "That's useful context," she said, which was the most neutral possible response she could have constructed. Bess looked at her with the direct, unhurried gaze of a woman who had seen a great many things. "He came in Tuesday asking whether you'd gotten settled and all right," Bess said, casual-like, as a neighborly inquiry. Sallie picked up the schedule again. "Well, that was kind of him." Bess smiled and said nothing further, which was somehow louder than anything she could have added. The first real conversation Sallie and Dexter had, the kind that lasted longer than the time it takes to untangle a horse's reins, happened on a Saturday in late June, at the town's weekly market, which took place in the open square beside the church. Sallie had been examining a jar of preserved peaches at a farmer's stall when she heard a familiar voice behind her negotiating the price of fence wire with such polite but absolute firmness that the seller eventually capitulated with an expression of relief, as if being allowed to give in to Dexter Alden was itself a small mercy. Turned, and he was already looking at her, and he removed his hat with a small gesture that was so naturally courteous it made her look away briefly at nothing in particular. "Miss Sutton, good morning." "Good morning, Mr. Alden. How's the schoolhouse coming along?" "The door is in," she said. "It's on the south side, which is where I wanted it, so that's a victory. The windows are still being debated, but I'm told they'll be resolved by August. And how are you finding Redemption Creek in general?" She considered this honestly. "It's growing on me," she said, "like a very specific kind of moss." He remembered, and he smiled, and there it was again, that warm, disarming thing that happened to her chest. "Can I walk with you a bit?" he asked, and she said yes before she had made the decision to say it. They walked through the market stalls with the easy pace of people who have unconsciously decided they are not in a hurry. He knew everyone, stopped to exchange a word here, a nod there, introduced her to faces she hadn't yet put names to. He did it without making a production of it, without any hint of showing off, just the natural courtesy of a man who was well regarded in a place and wanted to share it. She told him about her father's ranch outside San Antonio, about the horses she had known growing up. He told her about the particular difficulty of running cattle through the summer heat, about the creek that ran through the east corner of his property that never dried up even in August, which he considered one of the genuine luxuries of his life. "I'd like to see that," Sallie said, meaning the creek, and then felt the slightest warmth in her face because it was a forward thing to say to a man she had only truly spoken to for the first time that morning. Dexter didn't seem to think it forward. "You're welcome to any time," he said simply, and she believed he meant it. They parted at the edge of the square, and Sallie walked back to Mrs. Hannigan's holding the jar of preserved peaches and feeling, for the first time since stepping off the stagecoach into the red dust of Redemption Creek, that she was standing on solid ground. July came in with heat like a held breath, the kind of Texas summer that pressed down on everything and made the air shimmer in the afternoon. Sallie threw open every window in her classroom every morning, and still arrived home to Mrs. Hannigan's with sweat at her temples and chalk dust on her skirts. She had begun holding informal reading sessions in the evenings for a small group of children whose parents had asked if she'd start early, before the official opening in September, and she found she didn't mind at all. Teaching came to her like breathing, the way certain things do when you've been built for them. Dexter Alden stopped by the schoolhouse on a Thursday afternoon in late July with two of his ranch hands, bringing a load of lumber he had sourced from a mill up in Comanche County. He said the town council had arranged it, which was true, but Bess Hadley told Sallie later that Dexter had arranged for the council to arrange it and had covered the difference in cost himself, which the council had been too embarrassed to admit. Sallie found this out on a Friday. On Saturday morning, she walked out to the edge of town in the direction of the Alden Ranch, with the stated purpose of returning a hammer that one of his ranch hands had left behind, which was a completely legitimate errand, and also, she acknowledged privately, the thinnest excuse she had manufactured in her adult life. The ranch was 4 miles, which in the summer heat was a meaningful walk, and she was about halfway there when she heard hoofbeats and turned to find Dexter on the bay gelding coming toward her at an easy trot. He pulled up beside her and looked down with an expression of mild surprise that she suspected was at least 50% performance. "Miss Sutton, you're walking out this way." "I have your hammer," she said, holding it up. He considered this. "I could have sent someone for it. I needed the air. It's 93 degrees. I needed the hot air," she said, and he dismounted because of course he did, and walked the horse the remaining 2 miles beside her while she carried the hammer and they talked about things that were both significant and utterly ordinary. The way conversations are when two people are figuring out that they find each other worth talking to. She saw the creek that day, exactly as he had described it, a narrow, clear-running thread of water under the shade of a cluster of cypress trees at the eastern boundary of the property. She sat on the bank and let her boots off and put her feet in the water while Dexter sat a respectful few feet away and told her the history of the land in the quiet way of a man who has built something and knows its every imperfection. "You love it here," Sallie said, not as a question. "I do," he said. "I didn't expect to. I came here because I could afford it. I stayed because it got into me somehow." He looked at the water. "That probably sounds irrational." "It doesn't," she said. "It sounds like belonging." He turned and looked at her, then with an expression she couldn't fully read, but that did something very specific to the air between them. And for a long moment neither of them said anything, and the creek ran over the stones with its small, quiet conversation, and somewhere upstream a bird she couldn't see was singing a song she didn't know the name of. She put her boots back on. He rode back to town at a pace slow enough that they could keep talking the whole way. She did not sleep well that night, which she attributed to the heat. In August, 2 things happened that complicated matters in the way that real life tends to do, without warning and with a fine disregard for inconvenient timing. The first was the arrival of a man named Harlan Cook, who came to Redemption Creek with a letter of recommendation from a city councilman in Fort Worth, and a proposal to buy a significant portion of land from several of the smaller ranchers in the area, which he suggested would be used for a rail spur development that would bring prosperity to the entire region. He was smooth in the way that certain men are smooth, polished and pleasant and careful, and he had dinner with the mayor and shook hands at the general store, and left behind a feeling like a cold wind that didn't come from any particular direction. Bess Hadley didn't like him. Bess Hadley was almost never wrong. "He's buying up land," she told Sallie at the store. "Not just any land. He's going through the smaller landowners first, the ones who are in debt or whose deeds aren't perfectly clean, offering just enough that it seems fair until you realize later it wasn't." Sallie listened carefully. This was not directly her concern, she told herself, except that it was, because the schoolhouse sat on land that was technically part of a town lot that had been donated by old Pete Brennan, and Pete Brennan's deed had a complication that the county clerk had mentioned to Sallie in passing, and that she had not entirely understood at the time but was beginning to think mattered. The second thing that happened was that Clara Marsh came to Redemption Creek. She had not precisely been invited. She arrived on the stage one Tuesday morning, slim and elegantly dressed in a way that was slightly too fine for Redemption Creek's dust, with brown hair pinned in a fashion that spoke of city living and dark eyes that moved quickly over everything she saw. She was, Sallie reluctantly admitted, very beautiful. She was also, Sallie discovered through the thoroughly reliable medium of Bess Hadley by noon of the same day, in Redemption Creek specifically, because she had heard through some network of acquaintances that Dexter Alden had made a success of his ranch and had sent a letter ahead suggesting she might call. She wrote to him first, Bess said, a critical clarification. He wrote back to be polite. She interpreted polite as an invitation. Sallie arranged her face with great care. "That's a personal matter," she said, "between them. He came in here Wednesday morning and asked me what I thought he ought to do," Bess said. "I told him he ought to have more coffee and think harder." "Good advice," Sallie said. "He also asked if you had mentioned anything about it." "I have nothing to mention about it," Sallie said very clearly, to a jar of coffee beans that she was examining with great attention. Bess made the sound again, the one between a sigh and a laugh. The following Sunday was one of those August evenings that forgave the month's cruelty, cool after sunset, with a sky that turned colors in sequence, orange to rose to a deep, wide blue that seemed to contain everything. Sallie had been at the schoolhouse making final preparations, writing assignments on the newly delivered chalkboard in her careful, even hand, and she was walking home through the square when she encountered Dexter. He was alone, which meant Clara Marsh had not come to the Sunday social at the church hall, which Bess had told her the woman had attended the previous 2 Sundays in a manner that Bess described as highly pointed. He was sitting on the church steps with his hat in his hands and the look of a man who was working through something. He looked up when she came around the corner, and something in his face changed, like a room when a window is opened. "Miss Sutton," he said. "You look like you've been sitting here a while," she said. "A while," he agreed. He shifted to make room on the step, which was not precisely an invitation but was not an invitation either, and Sallie sat down beside him with her hands folded in her lap and looked at the square, which was empty and quiet and golden in the last of the evening light. "Clara Marsh is leaving on Thursday," he said, without preamble. "She's going back to Dallas. I spoke with her today and I told her that I hoped she found what she was looking for, but that I didn't think what she was looking for was here." He paused. She was not entirely happy about that. Sallie did not say anything. "I'm saying it to you," he said, "because I thought you should know. I'm aware it may seem presumptuous that I should think you'd want to know, but I believe you do." Sallie looked at the last line of color on the horizon, that deep rose fading at its edges. "I might," she said carefully. "I've been thinking," Dexter said, turning his hat brim slowly in his hands, "that there are some things a man ought to say before they get too long unsaid, because they don't get easier with keeping." He looked at her then, and his hazel eyes in the evening light were the same warm, shifting color as the autumn leaves she had missed since leaving San Antonio. "I think you are the most remarkable person I have met in a very long time, Sallie. And I'm not a man who says things he doesn't mean, so you can take that for exactly what it is." She was quiet for a moment, listening to the particular kind of silence that follows an honest thing well said. "I think," she said slowly, "that when I came to Redemption Creek I was fairly certain I was coming to build a life out of something practical, a job, a purpose, a place to be useful." She turned to look at him. "I wasn't expecting to find something that felt like more than that." He held her gaze steadily. "Is it more than that?" "I believe it might be becoming so," she said, which was the most honest thing she had said out loud in longer than she could remember. And when he smiled at her it was quiet and certain, and nothing like what she had expected a smile that changed things to look like. It looked like relief. It looked like recognition. They sat on the church steps until the stars came out, talking about nothing and everything. And when they finally stood to walk separate ways home, He reached out and took her hand briefly, just a moment, warm and real, and then let it go. She walked back to Mrs. Hannigan's through the dark and the cooling air, and she slept deeply and well for the first time in weeks. September arrived and the schoolhouse opened, and Sallie had 14 children on her first morning, ranging from the age of 6 to 13, with varying degrees of previous education and a universally excellent capacity for mischief. She loved them fiercely and immediately. She organized them into reading groups and arithmetic groups and spent her evenings marking their work and planning the following day's lessons with the absorbed intensity of someone doing the exact thing they were put on this earth to do. Dexter came to the schoolhouse opening. He stood at the back with his hat in his hand while the mayor gave a short speech about progress and education, and afterward he helped carry the new books inside from the delivery cart, and Sallie thanked him, and they stood in the empty classroom after everyone else had left with the smell of new wood and chalk dust in the air, and he said, "You're good at this." And she said, "I know," because she did know, and that made him smile the quiet, certain smile. He had fallen into the habit of walking her home from the schoolhouse on Friday evenings, which was not formally arranged, but which happened with such regularity that it had become one of the fixed points of her week. They talked about his cattle, about her students, about the books she was reading and the ones she was hoping to order through Bess's catalog, about the history of places they had each come from, and the lives they had each led before arriving in Redemption Creek. He told her about his parents, both gone now, and about the older brother who had stayed back in Missouri and sent letters at Christmas. She told him about her father's ranch and the bank, and what it had done to her family, the particular kind of loss that comes from watching something earned disappear into a ledger. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it in the way that simple words can mean enormous things when the person saying them is paying full attention. "It made me practical," she said, "which has been useful, but it also made me," she searched for the word, "cautious about attaching myself to things that could be taken." He was quiet for a moment, walking beside her in the October evening, the leaves on the one elm tree at the edge of town going gold. "I understand that," he said. "I think I've been running on a version of the same caution." He looked ahead at the road. "But I'm starting to think the calculation is wrong. That being cautious about loss doesn't keep you from it. It just keeps you from the good things that come before." She thought about that for the rest of the walk, and when they reached Mrs. Hannigan's gate and he said good night, she said, "I'll think about what you said," and he nodded and tipped his hat, and she knew he understood that she was not dismissing what he had said but was doing it the honor of taking it seriously. She thought about it for 2 days, and then she went to the Saturday market and found him at the fence wire stall again and said, "I think you're right about the calculation," and he turned and looked at her with an expression that was warm and uncomplicated and said, "I'm glad," and then offered her his arm, and she took it, and they walked through the market together in a manner that Bess Hadley observed from the doorway of her store with a satisfaction she did not bother to conceal. The business with Harlan Cook came to a head in October. Sallie had been paying quiet attention to the matter since August, talking to the relevant people and gathering a picture of what was actually happening. It was, as she had suspected, not the rail spur development it had been presented as. Cook was buying land on behalf of a land company out of Dallas that intended to consolidate holdings and lease the grazing rights back to the same ranchers who had sold, at rates that would be considerably less favorable than ownership. He had already managed to acquire the deeds on 2 smaller properties near the creek and was making offers on a third. The schoolhouse lot was a problem because Pete Brennan's deed had an error in the original survey that made the eastern boundary legally ambiguous, and Cook had apparently noticed this. He had appeared at a town council meeting with a surveyor from Fort Worth, and a document suggesting the school building had been constructed in part on land that was not technically Pete Brennan's to donate. The council was alarmed and confused in roughly equal measure. Sallie was alarmed and considerably less confused, because she had spent an evening with the county clerk's records in a way that she did not think Cook had anticipated a schoolteacher doing. She had found that the original survey error was not, in fact, an error in the deed's legal standing, but rather a clerical mistake in a secondary reference document that did not affect the title. She had also found 3 other deeds with similar references that would need the same explanation, because if Cook was going to use the argument on the schoolhouse lot, he could theoretically use it on every property that referenced that same secondary document. She brought what she had found to the town council and to the county attorney, a quiet man named Silas Howe, who had been practicing law in Comanche County for 19 years and who looked at her notes with increasing attention, and then at her with a measuring kind of respect. "Where did you learn to read a deed?" he asked. "My father's ranch was taken by the bank when I was 17, she said. "I read every document in that process 3 times because I couldn't afford not to understand what was happening. The understanding didn't save the ranch, but it stayed with me." Howe took 3 days and confirmed her analysis was correct. The schoolhouse lot was sound. The other deeds were sound. Cook's legal argument was built on a misrepresentation, and when Howe made this clear at a subsequent council meeting with Cook present, Cook went very quiet in the particular way of a man who has encountered a wall he did not expect, and he left Redemption Creek on the Wednesday stage and did not come back. The town council thanked Sallie formally and voted to name the schoolhouse Sutton Hall, which she found embarrassing but accepted with grace. Dexter said, when she told him about it on their Friday walk, "You know, I had heard some of what Cook was attempting, and I had been trying to figure out how to address it. I had made some inquiries, but I didn't get as far as you did." He looked at her with a plainly admiring expression that he made no effort to moderate. "You are remarkable, Sallie Sutton." "You said that once before," she said, keeping her tone light because the feeling in her chest at the way he said her name was doing something rather serious that she needed a moment to absorb. "I'll keep saying it until you're used to it," he said, and she looked at him and found she didn't actually want to get used to it, that she wanted to keep finding it as surprising and warm as it was right now. He stopped walking then, right there in the middle of the road in the October dusk with the gold elm tree at the edge of her vision, and the smell of wood smoke in the air from someone's early fireplace, and he turned toward her with a look that was measured and clear and entirely decided. "I would like to court you properly," he said, "with your permission. I know things are new yet, and I know you have a life you're building here that is your own and matters to you enormously, and I'm not asking you to diminish any part of it. But I would like the chance to show you that this," he gestured between them, brief and a little awkward in the way of a man more comfortable with doing things than indicating them, "is something real, and that I would take it seriously." Sallie looked at him for a long moment in the gathering dusk. She thought about caution and calculation, and about what he had said regarding the things that came before loss. She thought about the creek under the cypress trees and the evening on the church steps and the way he looked at her as though she was entirely worth looking at. "Yes," she said, "I'd like that." He smiled then, the full version of it, not just the quiet certain kind but the kind that changed his whole face, and she thought later that she would keep that smile somewhere reliable inside herself for a very long time. Courting, in the context of Redemption Creek in the fall of 1882, involved a number of practical arrangements. They attended the church social together on the last Sunday of October, which produced a level of interested observation from the town's population that Sallie found both touching and faintly comic. Bess Hadley watched from across the hall with the expression of someone who has won a bet she did not actually make. Old Mrs. Garrett, who taught Sunday school and kept 3 cats, seized Sallie's hand and told her she was a fine young woman with excellent prospects, which Sallie thanked her for and interpreted charitably. Dexter brought her wildflowers the following week, a modest and genuine bunch of late-season things he had apparently found along the creek bank, tied with a length of brown string from his saddlebag. She put them in a water glass on her windowsill and looked at them every morning while she drank her coffee, and felt an uncomplicated happiness that she had not associated with flowers before. He took her riding on a Sunday afternoon in November, on a reliable mare borrowed from his hand Clem, because she had admired the creek in summer, and he wanted her to see his land in the fall. They rode the perimeter of the property in the low amber sunlight of November, and he told her the story of every boundary, every fence line, every waterway. There was pride in it, the pride of a man in something he had made, but there was also something that felt more open than pride, something closer to sharing. They stopped at the creek under the cypress trees, which had lost most of their leaves now and stood with their bare branches against a bright cold sky, and she looked at the water running over the stones and then at him, and she said, "Tell me what you want, Dexter. Not the ranch. What you actually want." He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that meant he was answering honestly instead of quickly. "I want this not to be temporary," he said. "I want a life that's full, not just full of work, though I'll always love the work, full in the other way, with someone who I can talk to and think with and be quiet beside." He looked at her directly. "I want the things I built here to mean something beyond just me." She held his gaze in the cold, bright air. "I think they already mean something," she said softly. "I think you've been working so hard you haven't stopped to notice that they do." He reached out and tucked a loose strand of her auburn hair back from her face with a gentleness that was startling in such a capable pair of hands, and she did not look away, and the creek ran on over the stones, patient and certain. He kissed her on the ride back, when they had stopped to watch a hawk spiral above the south pasture, a quiet, unhurried kiss that tasted like cold air and felt like arriving somewhere after a long journey, and afterward she pressed her forehead briefly against his shoulder and felt him hold absolutely still so as not to disturb the moment. They were entirely, helplessly, and without reservation in love by the time the first winter frost arrived in Redemption Creek, and the only people surprised by this were the ones who had not been paying attention. December came in cold, and the schoolhouse closed for the holiday period, and Sallie spent the first week helping Mrs. Hannigan with the laundry work, because the older woman's hands had been giving her trouble, and there were 10 households worth of washing piled in the back room that needed doing. She didn't mind. She worked with her sleeves rolled and her hair pinned and the steam warming the room against the winter cold, and she hummed to herself because she was happy, which was a sensation she intended to take very seriously. Dexter came to find her on a Thursday evening in mid-December, and he brought a parcel wrapped in brown paper that he held with a formality that made her look at it carefully. "Merry Christmas," he said, early. She opened it to find a set of leather-bound teaching guides that she had mentioned once casually from a catalog that she could not afford, and inside the front cover of the first one in his handwriting, just her name and the date and the words, "So you'll have what you need," which was brief and plain and perfect, and she had to swallow twice before she could speak. "Thank you," she said. "These are thank you, Dexter." "There's something else I wanted to say," he said, turning his hat brim in his hands in the way he did when he was deciding on words. "I've been thinking about it for a while and I didn't want to rush it, but I also didn't want to let too much time pass, because I've been in the habit of letting time pass as a precaution, and I've recently been persuaded that's not the right approach." She put the parcel carefully on the laundry counter and looked at him. "I would very much like to marry you, Sallie," he said, "if you would have me. I know that's a significant thing to ask, and I know you've built something here that belongs to you, and I want to be clear that I'm not asking you to give any of it up. I'm asking if you'd be willing to share it with me, the way I'd share everything I have with you." The steam from the wash basins had fogged the window slightly, and outside the cold blue winter evening was settling in over Redemption Creek, and the marigolds in the alley were long gone, but the pot they had been planted in was still there, waiting for spring. And Sallie thought about all the things she had been cautious of, and all the things that had grown through that caution anyway, stubbornly and exactly as they should, like marigolds in an alley. "Yes," she said, and it was the same word she had said on the evening he had asked to court her, but it meant something larger now, something with permanence in it. "Yes, Dexter, I will." He crossed the room in 2 steps and took her hands in both of his, and they stood there in the steam and warmth of Mrs. Hannigan's laundry with the winter outside and everything exactly right in between, and he said, very quietly, "I'm going to take extraordinarily good care of you. I want you to know that." "I know it," she said, because she did. Mrs. Hannigan found them 5 minutes later and burst into tears of such immediate and profound happiness that Sallie spent the next 20 minutes getting her settled with a cup of tea and a blanket over her knees, which was not precisely romantic but felt, in its own way, like the realest and most complete thing she had ever done. They were married in March of 1883, when the spring had just begun to work its changes on the Texas ground, and the first green was showing in the creek bank grasses. The wedding was held in the church that Sallie had sat on the steps of in the August evening when everything had begun to come clear between them, and the whole of Redemption Creek attended, which was not a very large number of people but was a very warm one. Bess Hadley stood in the front row and cried without any apparent self-consciousness, which was the most emotionally unguarded Sallie had ever seen her. The mayor gave a speech that was longer than it needed to be but was genuinely kind. Old Mrs. Garrett wore a hat with a silk flower on it and told everyone within earshot that she had known this would happen from the beginning, which was not strictly accurate, but was said with such conviction that nobody contradicted her. The church had been decorated with early wildflowers, the same kinds Dexter had brought her in November, arranged by a group of the schoolchildren who had done it with the complete sincerity and considerable compositional chaos of children doing something for someone they love. Sallie looked at the crooked bunches tied to the end of every pew and felt something so full it pressed against the inside of her ribs like something alive. Dexter stood at the front of the church in a suit he had clearly purchased specifically for the occasion, dark wool, properly fitted, his dark hair combed and his jaw shaved, and his hazel eyes fixed on her when she came through the door with absolute and uncomplicated attention, the way he always looked at her, as if she was the most interesting thing in any room she entered. She wore her mother's brooch on the collar of her best dress, white and pale blue, and she carried a small bunch of the creek bank flowers, and she walked the length of the church with her head up and her spine straight, the way her mother had always told her, and she didn't feel like she might collapse at all this time, because she was walking towards something and not merely arriving without warning. The vows were the traditional ones, and when Dexter said his, he said them as though he had considered every word and chosen them deliberately, which she knew he had. When she said hers, she said them to him as though they were a private conversation, and she watched his eyes go bright in the way of a man who is feeling something deeply and is not ashamed of it, and that undid her slightly in the very best possible way. They rode out to the ranch afterward with the small group of friends who came for the celebration, and they ate the meal that Clem and the other hands had spent 3 days preparing with enormous effort and mixed results in terms of the biscuits, but excellent results in terms of the roasted beef. And there was music from a fiddle and a guitar played by 2 of Dexter's hands who turned out to be genuinely accomplished. And Sallie danced with her husband in the open air of the ranch yard in the March evening with the stars beginning to come out overhead, and she thought, this is it. This is the thing itself, and she was entirely and specifically right. Life at the Alden Ranch arranged itself around them with the satisfying logic of 2 things that were always meant to fit together. Sallie continued teaching, which had never been in question, riding into the schoolhouse 4 days a week on the reliable mare, whose name was Scout, and who had strong opinions about mud and carrots in roughly equal measure. She organized a library fund for the schoolhouse, and spent one particularly productive Saturday afternoon talking the county superintendent into providing an additional 2 crates of books, which she accounted as one of the finest hours of her professional career. Dexter ran his cattle operation with the steady, thoughtful management that was entirely characteristic of him, always thinking 3 steps ahead, but never so far ahead that he lost track of what was right in front of him. He was a patient employer and a fair one, and his hands stayed because they wanted to, which Sallie considered an excellent recommendation of a person's character. They had the kind of marriage that was built on genuine liking as well as love, which she thought was more durable than love alone. The way a structure built on 2 supports holds more steadily than one built on only one. They argued sometimes, because they were both people with opinions, and they disagreed about things like the financial wisdom of replacing all the fencing in the south pasture at once versus in sections, and whether the schoolhouse needed a second classroom before the end of the decade, and how much coffee was too much coffee, which Dexter maintained was a question with no real upper bound, and which Sallie maintained was a question she was increasingly qualified to answer on his behalf. But their arguments were the kind that ended with both of them listening, which meant they were not really arguments in the damaging sense at all. They had Clem to dinner on Friday evenings, because Clem was a widower and a decent man, and they had Bess Hadley when she could be persuaded to leave the store in her assistant's hands for long enough, which happened more often in the second year than it had in the first, because Bess had hired a capable young woman named Nora who had come out from Waco and turned out to have an exceptional talent for the dry goods trade. The first winter at the ranch was a real one, a hard winter, the kind that tests what has been built and what the people inside it are made of. There was a cold snap in January 1884 that froze the creek solid for 12 days, which Dexter said he had not seen in his 7 years in Redemption Creek, and the cattle required constant attention to prevent frostbite and to keep their water access open. Sallie, who had not experienced a working cattle operation in a winter crisis before, learned the realities of it very quickly and without complaint, getting up before dawn to help Clem carry water to the troughs when the pipes were frozen, and spending evenings beside the fire mending fence equipment and harnesses, because every pair of hands was needed. She also developed, during this period, a deep appreciation for the particular quality of quiet at the ranch on a snow-covered morning, when everything white and still, and the cold air was so clean it almost hurt to breathe, and the light came up over the east pasture in bands of pink and gold, and Dexter was beside her at the fence with his breath making clouds in the air, pointing out where the cattle had drifted in the night, his voice low and certain and familiar. "Do you regret coming here?" he asked one such morning, and there was something under the question that she recognized as the remnant of the old caution, the one they had both been trying to grow past. "No," she said, immediately and completely. "Dexter, look at this." She gestured at the snow-covered land, at the pink sky, at the cattle standing patient and steam-breathing in the cold. "This is real. This is mine. How could I regret it?" He put his arm around her shoulders without saying anything further, and they stood there watching the sun come up over their land, and the question did not need to be asked again. In March of 1884, 1 year after their wedding, Sallie told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen after supper, with the straightforward directness that was characteristic of her, and she watched his face go through a sequence of emotions so genuine and unguarded that it felt like something private, something she was honored to witness. He was very still for a moment, and then he crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her carefully, as if she were suddenly made of something valuable, which she found touching and also slightly ridiculous, and told him so, and he laughed against her hair and held on. Their son was born in November of 1884, a strong, large, loud boy who arrived with considerable conviction, and immediately displayed the hazel eyes of his father and the stubborn jaw of his mother, which everyone who visited agreed was a very promising combination. They named him Thomas James Alden, Thomas for Dexter's father and James for Sallie's, which made her cry briefly and privately before she composed herself and returned to the business of being a mother, which she approached with exactly the same thoroughness she brought to everything else. Thomas was a confident and curious child who walked early and talked earlier, and had the same fearless energy in approaching the horses that Sallie recognized from her own childhood. Dexter was with his son the way he was with everything that mattered to him: steady, present, paying attention, teaching by showing and by patience rather than by instruction. She watched him with the baby in the evenings and thought that this was what she had meant when she had told him his land meant something already, that the people who tended a thing with love gave it a meaning beyond itself. The schoolhouse had its second classroom built in the fall of 1885, which Sallie had lobbied for consistently and won, and she had 2 years after that a third student enrollment that required her to find and train an assistant teacher, a young woman named Dorothy Crane, who had just arrived from Tennessee with good training and excellent instincts. Teaching Dorothy the particular rhythms of Redemption Creek's children was one of the more satisfying things Sallie did in that period, passing forward the thing she loved in a way that made it larger. Bess Hadley, in 1886, received a letter from her husband in Colorado, asking whether she might consider a reconciliation. She showed the letter to Sallie on a Tuesday morning and then put it behind the coffee canisters and did not mention it for 2 weeks, at which point she retrieved it, wrote a thorough and final reply, and burned the outgoing letter in the store's iron stove, and then made a strong pot of coffee and seemed entirely at peace. Sallie asked no questions. Bess was fine. In the spring of 1887, their daughter was born, arriving in April with the same conviction as her brother but considerably less volume, and with her mother's auburn hair already visible as a faint warmth against her head. They named her Clara Rose Alden, Clara for no one in particular, just because it was a name that had sat quietly at the back of Sallie's mind, and she had liked its sound, and Rose for the roses that Sallie had finally got to grow along the south fence of the ranch house after 2 years of trying, which Dexter had laughed at when she chose the name, until she explained that there was nothing wrong with naming a child after something that required patience and persistence to flourish. And then he had agreed completely. Thomas, at 2½, regarded his sister with the complex and evolving feelings of a small child confronted with significant competition, and then, over the course of about 3 weeks, decided with considerable deliberateness that she was his personal responsibility, and thereafter conducted himself accordingly, which was both endearing and occasionally exhausting. The years settled into the shape of a life well made, not a simple life because no life with purpose and people in it is ever simple, but a full one, a genuine one. The ranch grew steadily, not dramatically but consistently, the way things grow when they are tended by someone who plans properly and works with the land rather than against it. Dexter added a small herd of horses to the operation in 1888, because Sallie had been talking about horses since the first week she'd arrived, and he had listened, as he always listened, and determined it was a sound idea both financially and in terms of general household happiness. Sallie's schoolhouse, Sutton Hall, became one of the better regarded small schools in that part of Texas, which was not a thing that happened accidentally, but was a thing that happened because of precise, sustained attention, and because Sallie refused to compromise on what children deserved from education. She had children who came from prosperous ranching families and children whose parents were sharecroppers on land they would never own, children whose families had been in Texas for generations and a growing number whose families had recently arrived from Mexico, and she taught all of them with the same seriousness and the same standards, which was not, in 1882 or in 1888 or in any year in between, a universal approach, and which she knew was a position that required defending sometimes. She defended it with the same thorough, documented, patient firmness she had applied to Harlan Cook's land scheme, and with the same outcome. The children learned. Their parents largely came to trust her. The county superintendent, after his initial skepticism, became one of her consistent supporters because results are a more powerful argument than any other kind. She also, in 1888, began teaching reading and basic arithmetic in the evenings to a small group of adults, farm hands and ranch workers who had never had the opportunity for formal schooling, who came quietly and carefully, uncertain of their welcome, and whom she received with exactly the same seriousness and warmth as any other student. It was Dexter who had suggested it, gently, over supper one night, saying he had noticed that two of his own hands could not read, and that it seemed to him this was a problem with a solution nearby, and she had looked at him across the table and felt a wave of love for him so complete and uncomplicated that she'd had to look down at her plate and recompose herself. "That's a very good idea," she said. "I thought you might think so," he said, with a quiet smile. They sat on the porch of the ranch house on summer evenings when the children were in bed, Dexter in the wide chair and Sallie beside him, or sitting on the top step with her back against the post, and they talked or were quiet with the complete ease of people who have nothing to prove to each other and no requirement to fill silence. The stars over the Texas plain on those nights were staggering, the kind of sky that makes the word sky seem entirely insufficient, and the crickets kept their vast, steady chorus, and sometimes she could hear one of the children turning in sleep through the open window, and the horses were quiet in the paddock, and everything she had built and been given and chosen was right there in the dark around her, as solid and real as the earth under the porch boards. "What are you thinking?" Dexter asked once, one of those evenings watching her watch the stars. "I'm thinking," she said slowly, "about the stagecoach, about stepping off it in the dust with 43 cents and no one waiting. And how I couldn't have imagined any of this." "No," he agreed. "I'm glad I came," she said. "I'm glad every single thing happened the way it did, even the hard parts." She turned to look at him, even Gerald Fitch's door being on the wrong side of the schoolhouse. He laughed softly. "The door is on the right side now." "It was always the right side," she said. "I just had to convince the council." He reached across and took her hand on the porch railing, and she turned her palm up and closed her fingers around his, and they sat together in the enormous Texas night with everything before them and nothing unresolved between them, and she felt the shape of her life as clearly as she had ever felt anything, its borders and its center and its warmth. There is a photograph taken in the spring of 1889, which was a new enough thing in that part of Texas that it represented a considered decision. A traveling photographer who set up in Redemption Creek for 2 days, and about whom Bess Hadley was deeply skeptical until she saw what the machine actually produced. Dexter had arranged for the photograph without telling Sallie, because he knew she would have spent the preceding 3 days in a state of preparation that would have exhausted them all. It shows the family at the fence of the ranch, the south fence where the roses are growing, in the spring sun. Dexter stands straight with his hat in his hand, and Sallie is beside him with Clara on her hip, and Thomas standing in front of them with the determined, slightly suspicious expression of a 4-year-old confronting a camera. Dexter's hand is on Sallie's shoulder, and she is turned very slightly toward him, and both of them are looking at the camera with the composed expressions of people who are also underneath, trying not to laugh at something Thomas had just said. You can see it if you look. The slight curve at the corners of Dexter's mouth, the brightness in Sallie's green eyes, the quality of ease between them, the way two people look when they have chosen each other with full knowledge and have not regretted it. Bess Hadley received a copy of the photograph and kept it on the counter of the store for years, which was the sort of thing Bess would never have admitted to doing on purpose, and which she explained, when anyone mentioned it, by pointing out that she kept all kinds of things on the counter, and there was no particular significance to it. Nobody believed her, and she knew it, and everyone was happy. The summer of 1889 brought 2 events of note. The first was that Clem, the ranch hand who had eaten Friday dinners with them for 6 years, and who was one of the people Sallie trusted most in the world after Dexter and Bess, announced that he was planning to buy a small piece of land near the creek's north bend and build a cabin. He had saved carefully and had a deed and a plan and a sensible approach to the whole enterprise. And both Dexter and Sallie told him they were genuinely glad for him and meant it. Though Friday dinners were quieter after that for a while, until Sallie organized a standing Sunday supper that Clem came to every week, and that gradually expanded to include Dorothy Crane and her husband and a rotating cast of Redemption Creek regulars, until it became one of the institutions of the place. The second event was that Sallie discovered she was expecting again, which she told Dexter on a June morning while they were both looking at the horses in the paddock, because there is no ceremonially correct moment for such news, and the horses happened to be doing something amusing involving a bucket that made the timing feel appropriate. This third child arrived in January of 1890, a boy again, with auburn hair from his mother and a loud, opinionated quality that was apparently his own contribution, and they named him William Franklin Alden. William for no one and Franklin because Dexter had once told her about a schoolteacher he had had at 8 years old named Mr. Franklin, who had been the first person to make him feel like reading was worth the effort, and she had thought that was a fine reason for a name. William did not sleep in reliable stretches for the first 4 months, which was a fact of new parenthood that did not improve with experience. And Sallie and Dexter moved through those months in the patient fog of people who have done hard things before and know that this too is temporary. They traded the nighttime rising without keeping score, which was how they managed most things, and when they sat together in the kitchen at 3 in the morning with the baby finally asleep between them and their coffee going cold, they looked at each other across the table with the weary, affectionate solidarity of two people who are tired in the way that only comes from caring enormously about something. "Next time," Dexter said on one such night, "we should get a rooster, a very loud one, so that waking up before dawn feels like a choice rather than a condition." Sallie put her cheek on her hand and looked at him. "There may not be a next time," she said. "No," he agreed. "There may not." He was quiet for a moment. "Are you all right with that?" She looked at William asleep on the kitchen table between them, his small face entirely at peace now in a manner radically inconsistent with his behavior for the preceding 4 months, and at Thomas's scuffed boots visible through the door of the children's room, and at Clara's small hand curled around the edge of her blanket. "I'm all right with everything," she said, which was true in a way that went considerably deeper than the question. Redemption Creek grew slowly through the 1880s in the way that small frontier towns grew when they were not located on a rail line and not destroyed by any of the various catastrophes that periodically reshaped the frontier landscape. New families came in, some from the east, some from further south, some from places that were harder to identify. The schoolhouse expanded its enrollment. The main street acquired 3 new businesses. A doctor arrived in 1888, a fact that relieved Sallie of one of her longer-standing anxieties about life far from the county seat's resources. The injustices of the era were not absent from Redemption Creek's life, and Sallie would not have said otherwise. She saw them in the way that certain families were regarded, and in the way that certain rights were unevenly distributed, and in the way that the law moved differently depending on who you were and what you were and where your family had come from. And she addressed the parts of it she could address with the tools she had, which were education and attention, and the particular stubbornness of a woman who had learned not to look away from a thing because it was difficult. It was not enough. She knew it was not enough. But she did it anyway, because the alternative was to do nothing, and that was not a choice she could make. Dexter supported her in this without qualification, which she had expected of him but still was grateful for, because in a small Texas town in 1889, it was not always the path of least resistance for a rancher to stand behind his wife's more progressive positions on who deserved to be taught and who deserved to be treated fairly. And he stood behind them anyway, consistently, and without theatrics. She loved him for it, among many other reasons, in the practical and durable way that love becomes when it has been tested by ordinary life and emerged the stronger for it. In the spring of 1891, Thomas started school, which produced in Sallie the most complicated emotional experience she had negotiated since stepping off a stagecoach with 43 cents, because her son would be in her school, which meant she was simultaneously his mother and his teacher, which she had thought about for a year, and had discussed at length with Dexter and with Dorothy and with Bess, all of whom had offered useful perspectives. What she had not fully anticipated was Thomas walking into the schoolhouse on the first morning of his enrollment with the absolute confidence of a child who had grown up hearing about this building as a beloved place, sitting down in a seat in the third row, looking at her with his father's hazel eyes, and saying, with great sincerity, "Good morning, Mrs. Alden," with the formality of a child who has been coached by his father on the importance of respecting the teacher's professional role. And the combination of the title and his small, earnest face doing it correctly was entirely sufficient to make her have to look at the window for several seconds before she could respond. She was an excellent teacher and a fair one, and she was if anything harder on Thomas than on the other students because she could not afford to be seen otherwise, and he rose to it, which did not surprise her, because he was his father's son in the matter of meeting a reasonable expectation with a reasonable effort. Clara started school 2 years later, and William 2 years after that, and by that point Sallie had been teaching in Redemption Creek for more than a decade, and Sutton Hall had become one of the better regarded schools in that part of Texas, and she had students who had graduated and gone on to further education in San Antonio and Austin who still wrote to her from their various lives, and she kept every letter. Dexter found her once in the kitchen reading a stack of these letters, 5 or 6 years' worth, spread across the table in the afternoon light. She didn't notice him in the doorway right away, and he stood there for a moment watching her, watching the way she held each one with care, the way she smiled at certain sentences, the way her face was full of something that was not quite pride and not quite love but was a word that should exist between them. She looked up and saw him. "Come look at this one," she said, as if he had not just been watching her privately for 30 seconds. "This is from Daniel Harker. He's in Austin studying law. He couldn't read when he came to me at 8 years old. His family had just come in from the South, and he spoke almost no English." Dexter crossed the kitchen and sat beside her and read Daniel Harker's letter, which was formal and careful and showed clear evidence of a fine education and a thoughtful mind, and then he looked at Sallie. "You did that," he said. "He did that," she said. "I just provided the conditions." "Sallie," he said with a gentle emphasis that meant he was not going to let her deflect this. She looked at him. "All right," she said. "We did that. This town, these people, the school, all of it together." He put his arm around her shoulders. "That's closer to right," he said. They stayed at the kitchen table long after the afternoon light had shifted, reading letters together, and outside the window the Texas evening was coming down in its long, gradual way, the sky going from blue to gold to the deep clear dark, and the horses were moving in the paddock with their evening restlessness, and somewhere in the house one of the children was arguing with another one in the particular register that meant it was not serious enough to intervene in. And everything was exactly as it was supposed to be. By the time the decade of the 1890s was well established, and Redemption Creek had grown and changed and settled into whatever it was going to be, the Alden Ranch was one of the settled places of the landscape, not the grandest operation in the county, but one of the most consistently sound, known for fair dealing and good horses, and a schoolteacher who had been in the region longer than most people could remember, and who had, by all accounts, done more for the town's character than any single thing, except perhaps the water in the creek that refused to dry up. Sallie turned 40 in 1898, which she observed with a small party at the ranch that included the Sunday supper regulars and Bess Hadley and Clem and Dorothy, and her husband and several of her current students' families. and which Dexter had organized with a thoroughness that suggested he had been planning it for longer than he admitted, down to the wildflowers from the creek bank that she found in every room of the house, the same kind he had brought her in November all those years ago. Tied with the same brown string. "You remembered," she said. "I remember everything," he said, which was not quite true, and they both knew it, because he regularly forgot where he had put things and occasionally forgot what day of the week it was. But in the manner that mattered, in the things that were significant, it was exactly and completely accurate. She danced with him in the ranch yard in the September evening, with their children watching from the porch. Thomas, now 14, with the beginning of his father's build. Clara, 12, and already formidably intelligent in a way that Sallie found endlessly delightful. William, 9, and currently going through a period of determined interest in anything mechanical, which had resulted in several interesting household incidents, but a genuine and promising curiosity about how things worked. The music was Clem's fiddle, and a guitar that Dorothy's husband had recently learned to play with variable but improving results, and the night was cool and clear and full of stars, and Dexter held her in the way he always held her, as if she were both entirely trusted and entirely valued, and she pressed her cheek against his shoulder, and watched their children on the porch over his arm and thought, with a clarity and completeness that had nothing wistful in it, that she had gotten every single thing right. Not easily, not without difficulty or loss or the kind of ordinary grief that visits every life. Not without the hard winters and the administrative battles and the unfairness in the world that she had spent 20 years pushing back against in every way she could from her particular position. Not without the moments of fear or the arguments or the nights when William was a sleepless newborn and she had been too tired to feel romantic about any of it. But right. Genuinely, lastingly, fundamentally right. She said so to Dexter when they were the last ones left in the yard, the children put to bed and the guests departed and the candles burned most of the way down. "I got everything right," she said. "I mean the important choices." He looked down at her with the same eyes she had spent 17 years learning every shade of, in every light and every season. "We got everything right," he said, with the same gentle emphasis as always. "Yes," she said, "we." The ranch house was quiet around them, and the stars were extravagant overhead, and the creek ran on somewhere in the darkness at the eastern boundary of their land, patient and constant. The same creek she had put her feet in one summer afternoon when everything was just beginning, when the first real shape of this life had started to become visible through the ordinary light of an ordinary afternoon. She took his hand and they walked inside, and the door closed behind them, and the night settled over Redemption Creek, Texas, with all its stars and all its quiet, and all was well.